Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Jim Hanink here with co-host Mario Ramos-Reyes and guests Professors Heather Erb and Peter Redpath. Professor Erb, who might be more of an auditor today, she'll be joining us in the next week or two. Professor Erb teaches at Lockwood State University and is on the executive board of the American Maritime Society. Professor Redpath, who's been with us before, is coming back, and here he is, and he's the president of the International Etienne Gilson Society and the CEO of the Aquinas School of Leadership, Management, and Organizational Development. We will, though, as always, begin with a prayer. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and kindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you will renew the face of the earth. Lord, by the light of the Holy Spirit, you have taught the hearts of your faithful, and the same Spirit help us to relish what is right and always rejoice in your consolation. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Well, Professor Redpath, Peter, if I may, we've sent around, and you've been a happy recipient, no doubt, 10 questions that we have for you. And if we actually cover 2 of them, that's all right. If we cover 10, that would be super abundant. Now, since you've been with us before, we've been already working to place you in the Thomist spectrum. So I'm going to begin, and this isn't our most important question, but just to get us located, could you tell us, Peter, which Thomists have contributed most to your thinking Thomistically, and which Thomists have joined you in thinking Thomistically the way you do?
The chief influences on my thinking related to St. Thomas have been Jacques Maritain, Etienne Gilson, Mortimer J. Adler, Father Armand A. Maurer, and Charles Bonaventure Crowley, who many people will not be familiar with, as well as Father James V. Shaw.
To whom we dedicated the show the last time you joined us.
Yes. Also Jude Doherty, in many ways. Father Shaw and Jude have been very helpful to promoting my reinterpretation of St. Thomas. So I'm very thankful to both of them, as well as Curtis Hancock, who's been a great supporter of what I've been doing. And John Dealey has also been may he rest in peace, has also been as the same with Father Shaw, as someone whose work has influenced me, and my work has influenced his. Remarkably, we come to a lot of the same conclusions using slightly different principles, focusing on slightly different principles in St. Thomas, but both related to contrary opposition and his teaching about contrary opposition. Father Crowley, for people who are not familiar with his work, came out of the River Forest School of Dominicans and was part of the Vincent Smiths philosophy of science group at St. John's University. So indirectly, the work of Vincent Smith and that group influenced me. Larry Azar was another undergraduate professor of mine who also had belonged to that group. And as far as other people that my work has influenced, I would count to some extent Fran O'Rourke who's emeritus now at the Irish College in Dublin, and also to some extent Richard Taylor, done work in St. Thomas and Islamic thought, and I've had a good deal of influence on a number of students from Holy Apostles College and Seminary who have taken my Christian wisdom course.
Yes, and that's where our esteemed producer Sebastian Mahfoud teaches.
Yes.
Well, let me ask another question, and it's connected, I think. When philosophers go back and forth and go ahead by way of going back and forth, the idea of dialectic comes to mind. And maybe you could, for the benefit of our listeners, say a bit about the role of dialectic in philosophy.
Well, I use that term, philosophical dialectic, in a recent article that I had written, that I had sent along to you, that I had on refining A.T.N. Gilson's teaching about Christian philosophy. I delivered it at the Sorbonne in 2018 for an anniversary celebration, a colloquium on Gilson. As it was an anniversary celebration for the École Pratique des Hautes Études at the Sorbonne. And the reason I brought it up in that article was to try to articulate why Gilson and Maritain had a difficult time articulating. Gilson, I was concentrating on more than Maritain, articulating for the Thomistic thinkers of the 20th century what they meant by Christian philosophy. The term philosophical dialectic can, from a classical standpoint, not from an Enlightenment standpoint, say, or a Marxist standpoint, where you have historical relations that are supposedly driving the course of history. Philosophical dialectic is that of the logical, of the logician, where you're assuming, for the sake of argument, somebody else's understanding of philosophy, and for the purpose of driving it into opposite, unwanted conclusions, undesirable conclusions. A good example of this, historically, and this kind of philosophical dialectic has driven the history of philosophy in the West, which I don't really think, for the most part, is a history of philosophy, strictly speaking. From Petrarch, we're going to come to that. But finish on dialectic. Yeah. A good example is the teaching of Averroes about the whole of truth being contained in the Quran, and that there are three different classes of seekers after truth. And only the philosopher grasps truth by being able to read the hidden teaching that is contained in the Quran. So, while the whole of truth is contained in the Quran, only the philosopher is able to read it. Now, Petrarch, the worst of people who are seeking after truth, according to Averroes, are the poets, who just basically, are driven by emotional arguments and influenced by them. And then the theologians, who you can appeal to their imaginations, but not really to scientific understanding. Right? Now, Petrarch turns Averroes on his head. Okay. And he says, in actuality, it's the poet who's the true scientist, because the poet has the special skill at reading, by means of which the hidden system of philosophy that had been buried, true philosophy, that had been buried in the work of classical poets, especially in the work of Virgil, and had been transmitted to the Romans, to the Latins. This was the beginning of the Renaissance humanist movement with Petrarch. This claim, Descartes will claim that hidden system of teaching is contained within his soul, and he's got the method by means of which he will be able to recover it. And after Descartes, Galilei will come along and say, well, the book of nature is written in the language of mathematics, and only the mathematician is able to tell you what the truth is in the material universe. And since that time, Western culture has more or less been dominated by positivism, and the positivistic claim that it's only the scientist, in the very narrow sense of the mathematical physicist, who's in touch with reality, and everybody else can't tell you anything about it. So this misunderstanding of philosophy, and identifying it with some sort of a body or system of knowledge, and that true philosophy is logic, or this systematic dialectic.
All right, so from dialectic, you've launched us right into what philosophy really is. And what I'd like to do is focus on two contending definitions of philosophy, or characterizations of philosophy. And I'm going to ask you to say which of the two you prefer, and not only prefer, you insist as being the superior. And after you tell us in one or two straightforward, yes or no, thumbs up, thumbs down, which of the two you think is better, I'm going to ask Mario Ramos-Reyes and perhaps too Heather Erb, if we've whetted her appetite for dialectic, to join in. Which of the following is most satisfactory? I've sent around to everyone 4, but I'm just going to look at the last 2. Chiefly, says option number 1, a logical system of abstract essences or ideas and their impersonal essential relations. So the focus is on a logical system. And alternative, chiefly a cooperative, transgenerational, individual, cultural, and psychological enterprise. So we're contrasting a logical system with a psychological enterprise. Which way should we go, Peter?
Oh, with the second one.
Aha. All right. Now, I wonder if Mario or Heather have anything to introduce at this point to what should we say, stir the pot.
Let me ask a question. Good morning, Peter.
Good Right.
Regarding the second definition that you chose, seems that this is the one that you explained a little bit in the paper you sent to us, which suggests that philosophy is chiefly a cooperative, transgenerational, individual, cultural, psychological enterprise, or transgenerational organizational, which I think is one of your favorite words right now.
Right.
And also psychological habit, another word.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a cooperative habit of individual human soul. And then you add something that caught my attention. You said, well, analogously consider a cultural educational one, which if we follow this way of arguing, you say, well, then philosophy is close to what Mortimer Adler recognized himself to be the case, and he agreed with Saint Bernard that philosophy is a cultural enterprise, etc., etc. And then you go on and explain that you are following the giants and all that. When I read this, Kate, came to my mind the memories that I have learning philosophy from the Ortega y Gasset tradition, which was quite historicist. And through his best disciple in Spain, Julian Marias, who was a personalist later in life. So that for them, the method of philosophy is history. So many of his disciples were, rather than metaphysicians, were historians, because that was the place or the river where philosophy was springing from and creating the claims that then philosophers or metaphysicians discuss. Now, my question is for you, more pedagogical. Why do you think in the American academia generally, the cultivation of history of philosophy is not quite strong as it is or has been in Europe most of the 20th century? In other words, it's very difficult sometimes to find textbooks. I can use a very banal example of history of philosophy. You find a textbook in Europe. Why is it the philosophy as a cultural enterprise, philosophy as a historical enterprise, not cultivated as much in the U.S. than in Europe?
Well, that's because philosophy in the U.S. is basically a solipsistic. It's essentially influenced by subjective idealism, which, as Maritain in Peasant of the Garonne had begged his readers not to understand was not philosophy, and he begged them to understand that this statement wasn't being made by a crazy old man. In saying this, okay, the American focus is on chiefly influenced by Descartes. Okay, in that philosophy is this individual, systematic kind of logic, where you're studying your own ideas. Now, some of the European historical studies, however, are just as basically solipsistic and non-historical, because the kind of history that they're dealing are fictional narratives that are based on Rousseau. So not all of the European studies are, strictly speaking, historical. They're ideological, and like Marxism, for example, okay? Where fictional histories replace metaphysics. and where mystery is removed, sense of wonder is removed as a classical philosophical principle. So in the schools in Europe, you have this tradition of research, all right, that goes back to the reading of classical texts, and which makes it very difficult to have that fictional narrative be able to dominate over the survival of educational institutions. And in relationship to Gilson, you were talking about, or at least I want to refer this to that. Gilson maintained, that there are two kinds of possibility. He says this in Painting and Reality in a footnote. I think it's in might not be in a footnote, but it also relates to a footnote. And one of them is conceptual possibility, and the other is doable deeds. And philosophy is chiefly concerned with doable deeds. Okay, while something might be intellectually conceivable, right, whether or not it's philosophical or scientific depends upon that concept being able to be applied in human activity, in reality, in the real world. And his work on the unity of philosophical experience is a prime example of this. That notion that philosophy is these abstract essences and so forth is incoherent in Gilson's work, because that's a quote from Gilson, where he's claiming that philosophy somehow is this logical relationship among abstract essences. Morata criticized him for making that statement, and he dropped it after that. Gilson uses the historical test as to whether or not the principles that we are claiming to have derived from reality, right, that we're using to measure our judgments, both speculative and practical and productive, okay? That's why I use the term applied. It's an applicational principle, and it relates both to speculative knowing and the productive and practical ways of knowing. Philosophical principles we claim we get from an observation of the behavior of things, of the way things exist, the way things are. Well, if that's the case, you should be able to take those principles, those concepts that you've derived from your observation of sense experience, wondering about sense experience, and apply them back to measure and to make intelligible what things are doing. And if you can't do that, right, you're not engaged in philosophical activity. Right? I didn't see this understanding of philosophy as transgenerational and cultural in Maritain and Gilson and in Adler until I started to write that paper for the Sorbonne. I saw it to some extent when I was working on a book on St. Thomas's moral psychology. So it was really when I started to work on this I realized it in relationship to the work of Stanley Yaki, where Yaki had said, and he was influenced by Gilson in this, that science is born of Christianity. And Yaki means mathematical physics, which I don't equate with science. I think Yaki's wrong with respect to that. But what he was saying, he's saying there is that philosophy as a habit that Aristotle tells us begins with the desire to liberate ourselves from the slavery and dangers of ignorance. Presupposes peace, right? And cooperation. That the ability to philosophize requires a leisure. On the one hand, it's true that leisure is the basis of culture, but it's prior to that, it's more true that culture is the basis of leisure. That is, doing the hard work, engaging in exertion of cooperative efforts to improve the human condition requires justice, as Plato points out in the book of the Republic.
Peter, I'm sorry I'm interrupting you, but I want to clarify something. If that then is the case, the philosophy is cooperative, is cultural, is an enterprise that involves more than one the individual philosopher, is not just a logical system of essences. Is that the reason why many philosophers are irrelevant in political issues today? And I just, you can use the European example. General philosophers are more committed to the public square, and they are more engaged in reality as such, political reality, so that they live in, you say, well, in a society where it can give them peace, and as you said, and then they have the speculative possibility of philosophizing. So if that is the case, this definition of logical system, what prevents philosophers from engaging in political issues? What I'm saying is that because generally when you read in the press, rarely, if not, it's very rare to read a column of a philosopher making the case about these issues in politics.
Could you restate that?
In other words, my question is, I don't see many philosophers dealing with political issues today because it seems that they claim or they have this view that philosophy is a logical system of abstract essences rather than a cooperative, transgenerational enterprise. That the public dimension is completely missing, and so they just seclude themselves in the ivory tower, and so they are abstract intellectuals whom nobody really reads them.
Right. Yeah. Well, they're in the publish or perish thing. You know, they're more or less trying to work their way up. Within the educational system. And I don't really consider them to be philosophers, strictly speaking. We use the term philosophy analogously, in one respect, classically, anybody who has the habit of wonder can be called a philosopher. Anybody that wonders about things, but there are cultural surroundings in which, if you wonder about certain things, you get put to death. They're not too receptive to having people who want to wonder. Right? And this
this is Jim here. Let me stir the pot some more, and I appreciate Mario's test, the test of if philosophy is what it is, properly understood, shouldn't it be engaged in the political enterprise of the day? Here's another angle. In trying to get philosophy recentered, and I'm thinking especially of some of the efforts of our auditor today, Heather Erb, where do great books programs fit in? We have, on the one hand, what we might call untethered activism that gets us nowhere, and on the other hand, we have a flight to the realm of essences, which gets us nowhere. And what we need is a kind of peace and space for reflection. Can the great books programs in their various forms be of service here?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah. I just wanted to concur with Peter's analysis there, and I like how he drew the idea of philosophy as an analogous term. This is what, of course, people miss. And so to understand philosophy is done by the individual, philosophy is done casually, this openness to wonder. Everybody's a philosopher, Socrates' ideal, at least in the early part of the Republic. So we've had a departure from that with this, I guess it's been introduced by Peter's, traced it beautifully with the history of philosophy, but also we have the German research model, which contributed, I guess, to, or imparted itself, let's say, to Harvard and Johns Hopkins, and what we're dealing with today, we're in the throes of being unable to really maintain the research model. At least it's an ideal for many, but it's unattainable financially for most schools, and intellectually, and of course culturally, and I would say morally. So this that was a great point that he made. This idea of the great books, I think where this fits in is more less in, one can look at it in terms of the history of philosophy and the trajectory towards solipsism, and and from that into positivism, and then into this postmodern debacle, which really just, is fractures communication itself. This is where we are in the throes of all this diversity. So there's that, but there's also the issue of the great books contributing. So, the great books can contribute to an understanding of that downward path, let's say, but it also, and I think, has a more important role in terms of recognizing that there is a contemplative life. There is a distinction between the theoretical and the practical intellect, something that Dewey completely missed and misunderstood, along with many of his ilk in the pragmatist and praxis vein. But the great books really contribute in understanding, I think, the relation of the moral virtues to the contemplative life. And so perhaps one could say the great books contribute to a proper understanding of philosophy by first and foremost, really, looking at the relationship between the moral virtues, how to build them up. St. Thomas says the moral virtues belong to the contemplative life dispositively. So is that a preparation? One has to have is this an extrinsic relationship to it? Or is there some deeper relationship of the moral virtues to the ongoing maintenance, really, and direction of the contemplative life? And so the great texts that we read, whether it's in literature, philosophy, theology, history, are really tapping into that nexus, or that ongoing, I don't want to call it a dialectic, because I don't think it's an explicit dialectic, but forming the appetites, directing the appetites of the student toward the good. And then there's that question, of course, dialectically, about the order of discovery. Doesn't one have to know the truth before one does it? And does that knowledge of the truth have to be an intellectual understanding, or can it be a more connatural relationship to our proper end? And I think the great books really sets up at least some helpful framework. It's not in the entire story of human formation, but it's a way of connecting in, the moral virtues to the intellectual life in an ongoing way. And I think this is really what's missing with so many modern philosophers. They've been taken in by this I would say it's a laudable research model, the German research model, but it really has been lopsided, and it's being promoted as a kind of in a way, it's a kind of a antithesis to what Dewey was doing. But they're both, as you sort of implied there, Jim, both wrong. Whether we have this flight towards activism, which we have in the public universities, which are devoid of philosophical content, as Peters said so aptly, and experience, or this move towards a kind of a research-based solipsism for a few elites. And I'm not saying that all research is solipsistic, that's absurd, but there's that tendency to fracture the entirety of the philosophical enterprise as something cultural and intergenerational, ongoing, that's a passed-on tradition in, I would say, perhaps the model of, Alistair McIntyre's work about traditions and cultures and how they have to mutually maintain each other. So that is, just off the top of my head, a sense of some of the background, really, of how the great books would be of service, really, to the philosophical enterprise, broadly speaking, in that general sense of philosophy that Peter was alluding to. So hopefully that's a bit helpful.
Well, it certainly is. Now, there are two things coming into tension here that I want to call our attention to. We have the transgenerational, and we certainly get that if we look at the great books. And we also have the development of the habitus within the person, the personalist dimension as opposed to the essentialist abstraction. And Peter frequently uses the term psychology. Now, one of our questions for Peter reads this way: has today's dominant culture largely subverted the everyday meanings of psychology and psychological? And I want to bring in an outside expert here, a fellow named G.K. Chesterton. Way back in 1931, Chesterton was lamenting discussions that seemed to turn on the appeal to some psychology. And in a particular column in GK's Weekly, he refers to somebody who talks about so-and-so has a superiority complex. And then a little later, he talks about so-and-so suffers from a sadistic tendency. Now, here's the part right from Chesterton. He says, considering us in America, although that phrase, Heather, because she's of Canadian concoction and extraction, but at any rate, here's Chesterton. All over American magazines, even in the most intelligent and interesting articles, there is sprinkled the silly slang of popular science, a welter of long words that are either utterly unmeaning or unmeaning where they are used or mean something entirely different. Insofar as they had any relation to psychology, or insofar as psychology had any relation to reason, the only possible effect they could have would be to provide the future with a widespread psychological study of softening of the brain. Now, if Chesterton was on to what we might call the therapeutic culture or psychobabble in 1931, I don't know what he'd say in 2019, and I'm especially interested in asking Peter how he can rescue the term psychology so that it can do the work for him that he wants it to do.
Yeah, you're right, Jim, that he was on to this, and one of the points of emphasis that I've been getting at in my own work is that for the ancient Greeks, at least by the time of Socrates, the existence of the soul, the human soul, and it's the tripartite division of the intellect, higher emotions, lower emotions. The faculty psychology of the soul was an essential part of philosophy, which the ancient Greeks identified with science. Science chiefly exists in the scientist. It's a habitus of a person who has developed virtuous habits that Heather was referring to. You get rid of the classical moral virtues, the cardinal moral virtues, as well as the speculative intellectual virtues that go along with them, and you no longer have philosophy because you can't have the formal object of science. Science gets turned into this relation of abstract essences, or feelings, and there's no way in which the scientific method becomes able to be made explicable in terms of its relationship to the scientist. Science is chiefly a personal activity that requires a specific kind of psychology. Not everybody is adapted psychologically disposed to be able to engage in scientific activity. One of the elements I was getting to before that Plato talks about in the Republic is that if you want to make advances in knowledge, and Aristotle talks about this in a couple of works. Getting at the truth is in one way easy because everybody knows something about it, right? But it's difficult to get at it with precision, right? And to be able to understand with precision the way the parts of wholes relate and cause activities without the cooperation of a multitude of highly intelligent people. So to form a culture that is philosophical or scientific, one which can progressively advance beyond the slavery of moral corruption and intellectual ignorance, you have to be able to have people who cooperate with one another. Like Plato says, even a band of thieves, and when he's talking to Thrasymachus, they have to treat each other justly as they're treating other people unjustly, and they have to know when and where to do it. They have to be prudent. Okay, so the first of the virtues that become cultivated within a culture that enable philosophy to be developed and sustained. Right? And instead of having, like Yaki points out with respect to mathematical physics, these false starts, where you have some people who are really bright and they're geniuses, and they couldn't form schools to transmit their knowledge to future generation. That's where that great books tradition comes in. Adler had seen this from the influence of Maritain on him, and Maritain pointing out, hey, that you have to have in order for you to have a educational institution, schools, you first have to have a public philosophy, in the sense of a public receptivity to philosophical reasoning, and this has to be inculcated as part of the moral culture. Every organization has a moral culture.
Now, I got to interject right here because Mario has something aimed in the direction that you're directing us. He has it at the bottom of every email he sends out, having to do with what the educator is tasked with today. What is that again, Mario? At the bottom of every email you send out, and it's something that C.S. Lewis says?
Yeah, the task of modern educator is not to cut down jungles, but to irrigate deserts.
To irrigate?
Deserts.
Yeah.
Deserts.
Yeah.
Irrigate the desert.
Yes.
Is that in the neighborhood of what you were talking about, Peter?
Yes. If you don't have a faculty psychology, if you don't have an understanding of the human soul, right, as being possessed of or generating different faculties that become habituated to perfect different human operations externally in the way we observe things through our external senses, and internally through the way we imagine and the way we judge and reason about things. You cannot develop a philosophical or scientific culture. Right? You don't have these transgenerational supports, and in order to do that, you have to have a morally virtuous people. You have to have every organization. Every human organization has a moral culture underlying it, one of justice and some sort of relative prudence.
All right, now here again, I'm going to tap Mario's experience because he's teaching away right now. Suppose you're trying to generate a group of students who will be receptive to the sorts of things that philosophers, when philosophy is rightly done, do. And suppose you tell them that this has to do with the development of a habitus, and that this is something that's rooted in the soul, and that in fact thought exists in the soul. Suppose you said to them that thought exists in the soul. What on earth do you think they'd say back to you?
Are you asking?
You asking Mario?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Well,
we're not talking about essences. Yeah. We're talking about the psychology of the human person, and we're saying that the habitus that we look for is grounded in the soul, and that the thought exists in the soul. And they look at you and they say, "What can you say?"
I think you're touching something very, very interesting, very delicate, I think. The first reaction, I think, to propose something of that nature is indifference, is apathy, is they don't care much about what you're saying. But if you propose something, before proposing that, the philosophy is a habit, blah, blah, you're arguing your view of philosophy, you begin with certain affection, certain togetherness with the student, perhaps their attention will increase. So, because many students today are more inclined, I'm talking about public college people who are out there in the culture which has no type of education coming from the great books. They are not coming from homeschoolers. They are people who are in the world. Generally, they react more to someone, let me say, it maybe sounds silly, but love them. So there is an affection that somehow begins the engagement of them to something, a proposal which is completely foreign to them. And I think that is my experience. Now, granted, there are other students whose education has been different from home, and they react differently. But the majority of people are not reacting in that way, and there is some contribution in the culture, perhaps, that increase that, which is digital media and everything in between. So that is my assessment about that. But before letting you answer or comment, Peter, I have one curiosity, and you are the one who know Mortimer Adler well, and I think you may have an answer. What makes a great book to be great? Because this is my concern. If I propose a set of readings which based on the tradition of the great books, sometimes I include Francis Bacon. I include René Descartes. And yet, when you study closely Bacon, he criticized those who cannot think things impossible because knowledge is power, etc., etc. And so in his Novum Organum, he even talked about the flawed inheritance of the past, the arguments of those who have come before us. The same thing you can read in Descartes, in his discourse, which is he condemned the book of learning from the books, an obstacle to true understanding, and so on and so forth. So it seems that both are against this definition you're proposed from for philosophy. So wouldn't then these two books be included as a part of the great books, or there's any other criteria or criterion by which we call a great book a great book?
Well, Adler's using historical criterion. There again, that term is predicated analogously, right?
Yeah.
Chiefly, to me, a great book is a work that contains great truths, and that help great principles.
So in this case,
to improve.
So in this case, these two books don't fit the bill.
No, but okay, as an historical enterprise, okay, great mistakes, advances in knowledge require specification of a generic understanding. One of the things that Thomists, people call themselves students of St. Thomas, don't understand that. According to St. Thomas, when we first sense something, we don't sense individuals. I'm always hearing, Thomists tell me we sense individually existing things. That's not true for St. Thomas. You sense individually existing wholes, and you sense them generically. What we first sense is something. We sense it more specifically and so forth. So immediate knowledge starts with an induction of a generic whole, a real genus, of a whole composed of parts, right? And that harmonize to generate action. And we're trying to figure out the internal causes, qualitatively different causes, in qualitatively different organizational wholes. That's the systems that people study. Philosophy, strictly speaking, is not a system. It's a psychological habit that is qualitatively different depending upon what sort of organizational wholes you happen to be interested in, and chiefly what you're interested in about the way they operate. Both the medical doctor and the biologist can study the human heart, but they do so from the standpoint of different interests, whether it's life generating or whether it's health generating. Right? Same thing in relationship to the medical doctor too, with respect to being a theoretical study or a practical study. So, if you don't understand these fundamental principles in St. Thomas, for example, that what we first sense is actually a genus. That makes no sense to a logician. If you think philosophy is a systematic logic, and I come along and I say, well, read St. Thomas's Metaphysics, his commentary on Aristotle's Metaphysics. It's absolutely clear. He repeats it over and over again in his commentary on the Metaphysics, that philosophy studies a genus and studies a real genus, and that the genus of the philosopher is not the genus of the logician. And in this sense, philosophy, science, chiefly exists in the scientist. Right? Now, I find that when I talk to students about the fact that what philosophy is chiefly interested in, focuses attention on, is organizations and the way they operate. I have a much easier time because they're at present, by the time they've gotten out of high school, they're skeptics. The modern educational institutions are institutes of sophistry, chiefly. They're ideological propaganda institutes for the re-education of the poor and the middle class. And so to talk to students about trying to defend principles, to get them started, wondering about things, that's the most difficult job in the world. But all students tend to be interested in organizations and in relationships, and the way they operate. Because even if they were going to criticize you, they have to do it in an organizational way.
How about in addition to the focus on organization and connected with it, you focus on the notion of the genus in much of your writing. I'd like to read the last part of the last paragraph of the paper that got us launched for our discussion today, and I want to read it in particular because it answers the question of just what Christian philosophy is. And then, Peter, you might comment on this. I'm sure it'll be very familiar to you because you're the author. We have this claim: the proper genus of philosophical speculation is the Christian, not the ancient Greek universe, and the Christian philosophy. Science of St. Thomas gave birth to a concept of the human person, from which the organizational psychology for generating philosophy, science as a complete nature, or at least a more adequate notion of philosophy, science than ancient Greek culture had been able to generate, could finally be realized. Second point, if this understanding of philosophy science is the proper or more adequate than the ancient Greek one, then it's reasonable to conclude that the proper way to predicate the terms philosopher, philosophy, science, scientist, is chiefly of the Christian philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas, and analogously of the philosophical enterprise practiced by the ancient Greeks and others to whom it might be somewhat applicable. So what's the takeaway from that, Peter?
Well, the ancient Greeks intentionally, from at least the beginning with Thales, are reducing the power of the gods in a way, because the ancient philosophy, as Aristotle points out, develops with poetic wonder, the wonder in the epic poems, and the ancient poets are claiming to be possessed of wisdom, because they're sons of the gods. They're inspired by the gods, and Thales comes along and he says, well, if the gods exist in things, if they're part of the physical universe and they influence the way things behave, while that might be the case, just by observing the behavior of things, to some extent you can get a knowledge of them. And so early on, philosophy becomes identified by the poets, and later on by the poets chiefly with atheism, kind of atheism. And they're hostile to development of poetry. The poetic culture is not very receptive to the development of the philosophical culture in antiquity. Now, the depiction of the gods as engaging in cannibalism and wife beating and rape and so forth, Socrates finds this fantastic. So he decides he's got to remove the gods even more so from the physical universe. and in order to be able to practice philosophy. Plato goes further. And then, Socrates has them. The gods are only concerned with the fact that we don't do, anything harmful, to ourselves. They're not telling us what to do. They're telling us what not to do. Right? Plato removes the gods entirely from the physical world, and Aristotle makes them move the planets and look up to the good, look up to the unmoved mover. So for the ancient Greeks, philosophy and theology, right, as Christians would understand it, become increasingly incompatible. Right? But the problem, as Maritain understood, was that you can't be right about the nature of human education and wrong about the nature of the human person. If you don't properly understand what human beings are, right, and you don't properly understand how you can connect, and C.S. Lewis talks about this in The Abolition of Man, the beginning of it. If you don't understand how to connect cerebral man to emotional, how the abstract speculative intellect is related in one human being as a kind of animal rationality, that the Christian understanding of a human being is not a soul separated from a body and is not an animal without a soul, but it's one in which the speculative reason is able to influence animal rationality through a faculty within what St. Thomas calls the animal part of the soul, which he calls cogitative or particular reason. St. Thomas is the first person, under the influence to a certain extent of Avicenna, who never really coordinated with the detail that Thomas did, that understood that without a particular reason in which you locate prudence and the cardinal moral virtues chiefly, your human being is not human, right? And science cannot be made totally intelligible.
You may not have heard it, Peter, or Mario, you may not have heard it, but there's a bell that's starting to ring in the background. And so I'm going to have to, as always, cut short our conversation, threatening, as always, to resume it next week or the next. I'm going to, as Cicero put it, tachebo, pass over in silence. I'm going to pass over in silence that we didn't get all the way to the bonus question, namely, what does Professor Redpath think of that struggling creative, what should I say, enlightening organization of the American Solidarity Party. We'll have him return to that later, but we'll end with, as we ordinarily do, something from today's liturgy. This is a reading from the second letter of Paul to the Corinthians. Brothers and sisters, we hold this treasure in earthen vessels, that the surpassing power may be of God, and not from us. We are afflicted in every way, but not constrained, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed, always carrying about in the body the dying of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our body. For we who live are constantly being given up to death for the sake of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may be manifested in our mortal flesh. Thanks to all our guests, thanks to our auditors, and we'll be coming with another podcast next week. God bless. Come, Lord Jesus, come.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.